Welcome to Healing After Harm, a place where we have nuanced conversations to explore pathways forward for individuals and communities after experiencing abuse in a learning or healing environment. We'll explore topics like accountability, repair, justice, whether or not to speak out or even platform the accused, and more. Our why: to speak to the numerous ways healing can happen and be supported at an individual, communal, and collective level after harm. I'm your host, Heena Patel. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for being here. I am so glad to be here with you today. It is my wish that whatever reasons you might have for tuning in, that you receive what you need through this podcast. Now, before we go any further, as a somatic practitioner and someone who's experienced long-term abuse in a learning environment, it's really important for me to share some reminders and some invitations. Please listen to this at your own pace, in your own timing. We are going to be talking about abuse, be it sexual, financial, emotional, mental, physical, and more. If you have experienced this, there's a chance that you might get activated through these conversations. I invite you to take your time and practice the principle of self-care. There is no rush. In my experience, the most sustainable pathway forward to healing is one that tends to the nervous systems of all those involved. So please take care of yourself. One of the reasons behind this podcast is mutual care and cooperation. In my personal healing journey, I reached out to a lot of people for support and resources. The resources, at least, despite how widespread abuse is in learning and healing environments, was kind of hard to come by, which is why I wanted to create this podcast. So if you have any questions, please reach out. You can find me on social media at Heena Connects. I would love to hear from you. So, how did I get here? I met my former teacher when I was 21. By 22, I had fallen in love. And I put falling in love in quotation marks because my concept and understanding of love today is very different than what 21 and 22-year-old Heena thought it was. I was groomed by him to be his mistress and was then engaged in a secret relationship that involved sexual intimacies for basically 13 years when it was all said and done by the time I've left. It took me over 5 years to fully leave him and that community. That's how deeply enmeshed I was with him, the community, and the organization. And in those 5 years of leaving, there was essentially 3 people that I knew that knew. My therapist, a former teacher who was like a second mom to me, and a close friend. Those 3 people helped me build the courage to leave. I can share all of this with ease and no charge now because I've taken the time to really heal from it. I am so grateful for the people, my teachers, my mentors, the practitioners I've worked with to be able to do so much healing on this journey: inner child work, ancestral work, addressing early life trauma, and more. A little more than a year after I went no contact with my former teacher, a knowing dropped in that I would one day speak publicly about my experience. And that brought a whole other layer of things to consider and work through on top of the personal healing and rebuilding of myself that I was already engaged in. Since then, I had a vague destination. I was going to go public and figure out the steps to get there, which included first telling my parents about my secret life and each of us processing that information as individuals and together. Ultimately, it took over 3.5 years before I truly went public. 3.5 years to process my anger, clarify my why, gather support, and heal my nervous system enough so that I did not collapse when I went public and would face people's comments and feedback, but could also stand with compassion and clarity in the face of whatever that would come. It was a journey to get there, especially because culturally, as someone who comes from a conservative Indian family, or more specifically, a conservative Gujarati family, the norm is that we don't talk about stuff like this, especially not publicly. This is not dirty laundry to air out in public. For a variety of reasons, people who care about me didn't want me to go public. I understood their protection and their love, and that they were concerned that I would then be marked as tainted, and who would marry me? These are all layers of things that I had to move through and work with the people that I care about in order to get to a place where I can talk publicly about my experience. While there are people I care deeply about who might not fully agree with what I'm doing, I do have their support to walk my path, and that is so invaluable. And this was a piece that was really important to me. I took my time to start telling people, telling my close friends, telling my siblings, my parents, my extended family, before I decided to share my story with the larger world. And in that time, I got clearer and clearer about my why. Initially, I thought that I was going to create a public call out, create a website and collect stories from people in my former community so that we could share about what was happening or what had happened for the world to see. Ultimately, that's not what I ended up doing. It ended up being 3.5 years after that initial knowing had come in that I would go public that I made a social media post in which I mentioned that I had been groomed by my former teacher and was his secret mistress. But that wasn't even the point of the post. I was actually talking about what are people going to say and how do we allow this idea of what people might say to dictate what we do or don't do in our life. But that post, it was the equivalent of dropping a grenade in my former community. There are people who had heard the whispers or thought that something was off that felt validated and horrified, while others who were completely taken by shock by what was unfolding and were thrown into their own process of trying to reconcile their experiences, looking back at the things that they had felt where they had overridden their intuition and more. Other mistresses learned that there were more than just them, something that I had been able to grapple with for a few years now. Do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. In fact, members of my former community and I are now engaged in a process to find our way forward. My commitment is to supporting the individuals in finding their pathway to healing, because that is what I truly want, is for people to find their way to greater health even after experiencing abuse. It's so important to be talking about the abuse that happens in learning and healing environments. There's so many people I know that have experienced this in a myriad of forms and then have struggled to find their sense of self and identity. Especially as someone who comes from the performing arts world, I can't tell you the number of dancers and musicians I know who, when they finally left the place where they got a lot of their training, there was so much pushback from their teachers and mentors about carving their own path instead of staying with them and doing things the way that they told them to do it. That too is a form of abuse. So here I am. I want to talk about the ways that we can find our ways forward, talk about the ways that people who've experienced abuse can find their ways back to themselves and understand the larger dynamics that are at play. Talk about the ways that we can support survivors of abuse. Talk about the ways that communities can come together to repair and find healing. There is no one way to do this. In fact, it's very likely you're going to be hearing opposing perspectives on what someone should or shouldn't do as they go on their journey. And I firmly believe there is no should. It is about each person finding their own truth and clarity to find their way forward. Healing after harm is a place that I hope that you can have things to respond to, get inspired so you can find your own pathway forward. I'm so excited to be bringing people onto this podcast who have been supports to me, who have experienced this in their own ways to share their pathways forward towards the larger aim of collective liberation. Because that is what I truly believe this is all about. How we heal after harm, how we find our place and return back to our center is our path to liberation, to finding a more truer expression of ourselves, to liberate ourselves from the ways that we maybe had given away our agency and given power to someone else instead of trusting our own sovereignty and finding our own power within us. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to being on this journey with you.